There was a patient named Mrs. Grant, and one day, 8:15 in the morning, a nurse is making rounds through the nursing unit where Mrs. Grant is recuperating from elective surgery and discovers that Mrs. Grant is suffering a full-body seizure. The nurse does the right thing, immediately calls a code. Code team swarms Mrs. Grant. Someone draws blood to run it down to the lab to see if that leads to any clue as to what's going on. Mrs. Grant herself is rushed up to radiology. They want to see if there's any neurological explanation for her condition. The radiological exams prove negative. There's no mass, no bleeding, nothing like that. Mrs. Grant is brought back to the nursing unit, at which point the care team intersects with Mrs. Grant and the results of the blood work. Turns out she's got an undetectable serum glucose level. Said more simply, almost no blood sugar. The seizures, due to the fact that her brain is being starved for fuel, what does the team do? Exactly the right thing. They try to raise Mrs. Grant's blood sugar levels. Turns out it's too little, it's too late. Mrs. Grant lapses into a coma. The coma proves irreversible. And 7 weeks after what was elective and successful surgery, Mrs. Grant is removed from life support. Begs the question, what happened? Well, to the credit of this medical staff, they try to answer that question almost in the midst of this crisis. As Mrs. Grant is being stabilized, they're trying to ask, what happened? What's going on? And so, first, of course, they ask the day nurse who encountered Mrs. Grant at 8:15, what do you know about Mrs. Grant's condition and why was she suffering seizures? Well, the day nurse, of course, knows nothing. This was her first encounter with Mrs. Grant. They asked the night nurse. Turns out he doesn't know much either. He had seen Mrs. Grant at 90 minutes earlier at 6:45. The conditions were that an alarm had sounded indicating a possible occlusion, a blood clot, perhaps in the central line. So he had responded to that, doing everything right. He had gone to Mrs. Grant's room, gotten a vial of heparin, injected the appropriate dose of heparin into the central line to break up any potential blood clot, checked that Mrs. Grant was resting well, and went about his way to care for his other patients. Between 6:45 and 8:15, he hadn't checked on Mrs. Grant. She was apparently resting comfortably. So they're a little bit dumbfounded as to what might have happened to Mrs. Grant until they start surveying, policing Mrs. Grant's room, just trying to find out what was where. As they're doing all this, someone gets to the Sharps container where medical waste is disposed and is going through and trying to account for all different types of medication and whatnot, and says, you know, this heparin you were talking about, I don't see an empty vial of heparin, but you said you were in Mrs. Grant's room to administer it. So everyone assumes that this nurse, like every other nurse in the world, was moving quickly one job to the next. Might have taken the heparin, put it on a counter. They can't find it there. Might have put the heparin in a pocket on a smock. Can't find it there. Can't find an unaccounted vial of heparin in another room. It's a big mystery. They continue to do the inventory of the Sharps container, and they discover something instead. An empty multi-dose vial of insulin. Ooh, where did this come from? Well, the first explanation, of course, is it shouldn't have been in Mrs. Grant's room. There was no order for insulin, no record of administering insulin. So they say, well, maybe that insulin, empty vial of insulin arrived exactly as they thought the heparin might have left, in this pocket of a nurse's smock. Well, they survey the entire unit, and they can't find an unaccounted for empty vial of insulin. That's when they start putting two to two together. It goes from more of an interview to more of an interrogation of this nurse, saying, I don't understand. I simply don't understand. We're looking for an empty vial of heparin, but instead I'm holding an empty vial of insulin. What is going on? And the nurse, needless to say, is protesting. I just don't know. I don't know. And in the midst of this interrogation, the person's actually doing it. Son of a gun. They say, what's the matter? He said, with all my ranting and raving, I don't actually know which hand is holding a vial of insulin and which is holding a vial of heparin. So what do you mean? He says, well, my hands wrapped around them, they feel the same, they're about the same size, the same weight, the same shape. What if you look at them? Well, look at them. They appear about the same. They're the same color. What if you read the label? I said, yeah, well, it's a tiny little label with even smaller print. Yeah, if I read them, one says insulin, one says heparin. I started thinking through, what's the context in which this insulin or heparin might have been used? Well, it was the end of a night shift. The nurse was tired. There was an alarm sounding. The nurse was in a rush. Mrs. Grant was asleep. The room was dark. When this nurse went to reach for heparin, where did he reach for it? On a nursing cart. What else is on the nursing cart 18 inches away? The store of insulin. So what do they think happened? in the midst of doing exactly the right thing, nurse in the right place at the nursing station, hearing the right sounds, interpreting them correctly, trying to do exactly the right thing, in a rush to do the right thing, the nurse inadvertently grabbed several doses of insulin, injected them into the central line inadvertently, and ended up killing Mrs. Grant.